So welcome again to the North Carolina Botanical Garden for another opportunity for hearing more about our Saving Our Savannas program, Stories of the Longleaf Pine. We have some great stories today from Earl Ijames. Earl is an Emmy-winning farmer and historian and has been an amazing curator at the North Carolina Museum of History, where he's worked since 2008. He's also worked as a reference archivist and photograph archivist at the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. In addition to his work in history, Earl is also a seventh-generation farmer, currently farming in Johnston County, North Carolina. He graduated from North Carolina State University with a degree in history and minors in economics, English, and African American studies. He's been involved in so many historical projects, I can't name them all here, or he won't have any time to talk. But just a few examples: subject matter expert, consultant for the film Looking for Lincoln, a host panelist for the African American Genealogy and History Forum National Geological Society Conference, and as a subject matter expert for the BBC film production of Bleeding Pines of Turpentine in Southern Pines, North Carolina. Also as a 2022 Emmy Award winner for preserving the Longleaf Pines film with Spectrum News. One last note, he was recently involved with the 2023 Black Farmers Conference at the White House and U.S. Senate and has created a video on historically Black colleges and universities. Earl, I welcome you to this platform here. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Good afternoon. Happy Longleaf Thursday. Yes, thank you. My name's Earl Ijames. I'm a farmer and historian, and it's my honor and pleasure to be here with you today at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And I would also like to acknowledge our steering committee, our wonderful folks, Joanna, David, and others on our committee. It's been a real joy to work together on this project and look forward to working more. Also want to thank all y'all for coming out on this rainy day. The old timers, we would call it a freshet that we might get this afternoon. So I certainly appreciate you coming out. And also thank you, Historic Hayti, for coming out and supporting. So again, my name's Earl Ijames, and I'm here to present a program called Naval Stores and the Real Tar Heels, a story of the Longleaf Pines. The date is very important, April 11th, 2024. Warning. The following presentation contains languages and images that are historically accurate. Viewer discretion is advised. As Joanna mentioned, I am a seventh-generation North Carolinian, and every now and again, I can lapse into country grammar straight from North Carolina. So we will learn some of those terms today, both in historical terminology as it relates to what I call real tar heels. And so in the photograph, you'll see, and I put unidentified tar heels, hauled resinous products from the Carolina longleaf pine forest in the 1880s. And in the photograph are African Americans, but as photograph archivists, one of the things I learned, a lot of early photography deliberately did not include the names of African Americans and women. And so we make it a point to make that point so that hopefully someone will see these photographs and say, hey, that's my Uncle Bill or someone. So here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun doth shine, where the wheat grow strong and the strong grow great. Here's the down home and the old North State. All right. That's our state motto. It was adapted by the legislature in 1957 at a time when the naval stores industry had pretty much ceased to exist in North Carolina. We had become fully tobacco road by that time. And so the idea and the history of naval stores not only was disappearing, but also the source of it. So on the image, you see our state flag. The official state flag of North Carolina displays two dates: the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence of May 20th, 1775, and tomorrow we will celebrate and commemorate April 12th, 1776, Halifax Resolves Day. And I'll have the privilege to be in historic Halifax tomorrow to launch our USA 250, help to launch our USA 250 campaign in our state. So, X marks the location of the British colonial and commercial and colonial court hub of Halifax, North Carolina. Located at the intersection of the highest navigable bend on the Roanoke River and an old Tuscarora Nation trading path, which just happens to be paved over as present-day Highway 301. Halifax was authorized by the British then Colonial Assembly in 1757 and incorporated 1760. Named for George Montague's second Earl of Halifax, I like that guy's name, who was also president of the Board of Trade. The town was originally a hub for naval stores. After the 1793 cotton gin, however, most of the original Longleaf pine forest was cut, harvested to make way for what we know as traditional cotton and tobacco plantations after 1793 into 1800s. So what I hold in my hands here is an original manuscript that was out of Halifax, North Carolina, for the bicentennial in 1976. And I'm going to read part of it because I thought it really intriguing when we discovered it or rediscovered it. During this great bicentennial year, the Horner Waldorf Corporation is pleased to attempt an explanation of the importance of wood throughout our nation's history. Our company is hopeful that as one observes the annual growth increments of longleaf pine and ball cypress cross section, each individual will feel closer to our ancestors, fellow citizens of today and our country. It was extremely interesting to note that the longleaf pine in this exhibit was growing when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, this indicates in 1976, there was a longleaf pine somewhere in Halifax that dated back to the Revolutionary War era. I'm still looking for it. If anyone knows where it is, let me know, and we'll have a party at the pine. Now, Carolina was chartered by England in 1663 and named by King Charles II in honor of his father, Carolus. I bet all y'all knew Carolina was actually named for a guy. The land from Virginia, chartered by the Virginia Company of London in 1607, and that Virginia-North Carolina line, down to what is the present Alabama-Florida line, and extending westward thence, would be claimed as the Carolina Charter. Within that included 93 million acres of virgin longleaf pine forest extending from the coastal plains into the Piedmont of the Carolinas westward to what we call the piney woods of East Texas. In 2015, you see your favorite farmer and historian in the photograph there hugging my dear friend Methuselah, our 475-year dinosaur, the oldest known living longleaf pine on Earth. Known, we say. And so again, that image was taken in 2015, and I think in April 20th of this year is the Party at the Pines. That's also part of our project here. So I would encourage you to go to Waymouth Woods on April 20th of 2024 for a Party at the Pines.
Not far from Pinehurst, the 915 acres that make up the Waymouth Woods Sandhills Nature Preserve give visitors a trip back in time as they hike and explore the park's forests. A forest that was once dominated by our state's signature tree, the longleaf pine. For historians Ray Owen and Earl Ijames, the arrival of spring reveals the history that embodies the longleaf pines of Waymouth Woods. Their hike includes a visit to the park's oldest resident.
Hey, look, Ray, there's our old buddy right there.
Yeah,
hey.
This is the oldest known longleaf pine in the world, in the universe.
Yeah, my old friend. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, and here we are, the first day of spring.
Yeah, this is A real treat. And he's glad to see us too, right?
I think so, Earl. We gotta hug this
we gotta
sucker.
hug him, yeah.
Yeah, man.
Hey,
Waiting
man.
for us.
All right.
How you doing? You know, we have around Earth Day every year, the Sandlanders here. We have.
It's a beautiful tree.
It is beautiful,
Yeah.
but we have the birthday party for the oldest pine, and we come out here and there'll be like 100 people, and we all come out and hug the tree.
He is celebrating about 450.
No, over 475.
475.
So when
okay.
they cored the tree, they cored it kind of about here maybe. It was kind of higher up. I don't remember the exact spot. UNCG came and did it. But the tree is probably older because when you think about it, for it to get this high, how long did that take? That might have been, 10 years, 20 years. Round timber is the local name for trees that have stood the test of time. And if you look over to our right here, you see the white blaze on the trees. And these are marked for the red cockaded woodpecker. And they're the only woodpecker that bores into living pines. And what happens is the resin will run down, what people call sap, and it prevents varmints from getting in to disturb the nest. And so the blaze is when the fire ecology here, everything has to have fire to feed the forest to keep it alive. And the blaze is so that they don't burn up the tree during a controlled burn.
While numerous pine tree species fill North Carolina's state lands, the distinctive longleaf pine is easy to identify.
So the long needles on the longleaf pine tree is its distinct signature. The needles can range anywhere from 8 inches to 16 inches in length, depending on the phenotypes. These particular kind that grow in the Boyd tract will have this signature distinct longleaf, like this grass stage emerging into a rocket stage longleaf pine tree. And you can see the distinct candle that's emerging here. If you're walking alone on one of the trails at Waymouth Woods and you come upon a longleaf pine tree with an unusual looking scar on it, why, you are witnessing history. In this case, this is evidence of real tar heels, or someone who worked this tree for turpentine, tar, and pitch about 125 or 150 years ago. So you might say, well, what do you have in your hand there, Earl Ijames? Good question. This is a boxing axe, a tool of the tar heels, and this would have been used on the first day of spring like we have now, when the sap begins to flow up from the tree. Turpentine season begins on the equinox. And this boxing axe would have been wielded between the bark of this tree to inject about a 3 or 4 foot wound, as you can see in this tree, so that it exposes the cambium layer.
The thing to remember about this particular tract, a lot of effort, a lot of science is going in to try to bring it back.
The Waymouth Woods Sandhills Nature Preserve is at 1024 North Fort Bragg Road in Southern Pines, and it's open daily. To find out more, go to ncparks.gov, and to learn more about the year of the trail, go to greattrailsnc.com.
Highly recommended going to Waymouth Woods if you haven't been there. In the film, you'll mention, I talk about I have my country grammar faux pas, and I mentioned that you would go 3 to 4 feet with the boxing axe. Well, you wouldn't do that because you would chop the tree down, but you would go 3 to 4 inches between the bark with this instrument. It's called a boxing axe, and it has a particular type of curve to it so that it allows for wedging between the bark and ripping like that. And so what this does is it allows for the tree to get that wound and to start bleeding. Also in the film, you'll see that we identified, and when you're out in the forest or a lot of times in neighborhoods these days that have been cleared from forest, hopefully you'll see some longleaf, at least some pines and some longleaf. And one way that you can distinguish, this is a grass stage about to emerge into a rocket stage. And you can see by the little tip there, it's about to really shoot out. And so this baby here is about 7 years from a seed grown in a pot where it would grow a little bit taller if it were actually in the ground. This is a grass stage version. And both of these items we grow on our farm here in Johnston County. This is a grass stage of about 2 years from a cone. And you can see it's just starting to emerge literally as grass. And a lot of times in a forest, you won't necessarily see it unless you know exactly what you're looking for. Thank you, David. All right. In 1705, the English Parliament passed probably the richest bounty in the colonial era for naval stores. In 1705, the Naval Stores Act was passed by the Parliament and encouraged Virginians and colonists from places like Barbados to come to Carolina, specifically the northern part of the colony. At that time, North and South Carolina had not been split. It was still Carolina. But the British were making a concerted effort to concentrate naval stores, even though many of them started in Northeast and South Carolina and in the middle part above the low country. There is a wider range and more swath in Northeastern North Carolina going up to the Great Dismal Swamp in Southeastern Virginia. So you see on the screen, the bounty that was paid in 1705 was quite big. It's a pretty big bounty. 6 pounds per ton on hemp. Well, you might say, Earl Ijames, what in the world does hemp have to do with naval stores? Great question. This is a crude replica of the planks of a ship. The planks would have been cut and hewn together, but of course, between it is not waterproof. And so hemp fibers, the stalks, would be fastened into ropes and placed between the planks and pitched to waterproof it. And this is a process that literally goes back thousands of years. You can read about it in the Old Testament. The Pharaohs and the Phoenicians and people like that are doing the same exact thing. And so this is literally transferred to America in the colonial era first. And the British actually attempted to do naval stores in all the colonies. But of course, in New England and in the Middle Atlantic, the pines quickly disappeared and they didn't grow back. And that was abandoned and more concentrated in Carolina in particular, and the northern part of the colony after 1705. But the hemp was used to make masts and rigging for ships, as well as clothing for many of the sailors. In fact, it was the most popular clothing used at that time because most people could not afford cotton then. There's a real double entendre to high cotton. So redeeming the bounty was indeed risky business though. You might say, well, why is that? Well, we'll get to that. Britain also ramped up the international trade in human beings. Now I'm coining this phrase, trade in human beings, not a slave trade per se. We're talking about people who were turned into slaves. Of course, we all know on the continent of Africa, the world's oldest civilizations, the most advanced civilizations. And on the western part of Africa was a place that Europeans called Guinea. And specifically is the present day area of the Gambia, Senegal, on the western coast of Cape Verde in Africa. So people from this part of the world have been adapted to working in the forest for thousands of years and have developed a higher immunity to insect-borne diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and over on the continent, there's this thing called tsetse fly that gives you sleeping sickness. So that part of Africa is very similar to the low country of the Carolina in as far as this dense wetland type of forest terrain. And so many of these folks were literally identified by slave traders, put on boats, and sent over here specifically for the purpose of working in the Longleaf pine forest. So once again, you see, quote, unidentified, end quote, African American men carrying dippers and reservoirs in the Carolina Longleaf pine forest. So this is a kind of a more recent, say late 19th, early 20th century version of what would have been used to collect sap. And you can see the residue of sap having been used in years past. And you see on the screen there is a guy who we call the Big Dipper. You know, he was the first Big Dipper, not Wilt Chamberlain. So yeah, y'all got to laugh at my jokes. So, but you see on the left, he's holding the dipper, and on the right, he's holding the dipper. And then there's a reservoir. And his job was to keep that sap with some form of viscosity so that it could be distilled. And that was a job in and of itself, I would imagine. If you ever have, has anyone here ever attempted to keep sap from calcifying? I wouldn't want to task anyone with that. So the economic appeal of the naval stores also complemented the crop cycle and induced the emerging slave trade. Tar, though produced in the summer, is usually marketed in the winter after the harvest. It was also cheap to produce because it was made from dead or dying trees. So when you box and you hack and you scrape a pine tree, it starts to wither and it drops what the old timers call laps, or the edges of the trees or parts of the limbs. And at the end of turpentine season, when the equinox goes down in September through the fall months and into the winter months, after most crops are usually harvested, that's when tar is produced. And typically what would happen is you would hack a land grant and you would go from one side to the other, you would come back, you collect these laps and you would find a particular grade. Like in the photograph, you can see this land is on a higher grade in the background and a lower grade in the foreground. And on the upper side, you can see where there used to be a pile of laps or a charcoal mound, right? The profits were substantial and the slaveholder had little investment beyond the people themselves. They actually lived out in the forest. If that slaveholder wanted to get an overseer, that would be added expense. But in kind of a perverse way that slavery worked, some of these people actually had an economic incentive to get these crude turpentine, tar pitch, and redeem the bounties in absentee of a slaveholder so that they actually had an economic incentive, sometimes depending on the slaveholder, to actually get these to the market. And again, that bounty was quite substantial. So what you see in the photograph, this is circa 1880s image, again, unidentified African-American men working, or what the old timers call sweat and tar. Has anybody ever heard of sweat and tar? Sweat and tar. That's a process that in the ground takes a week or two before you actually begin to get the tar, sweat it out. Now, there are ways these days that you can expedite that process, but during the Colonial antebellum era, when you raked up laps and you had a big hole in the ground, or, God bless you, or you were on a charcoal mound, imagine during hurricane season, September, October, November, you're charged with keeping a low-grade 200, 300-degree fire going for about a week or two. And then at the end of that time frame, you get in there and you scrape out with the viscosity of tar down the flue, and you collect it into the barrel, as you see there. So the old-timey people pronounce this tarkle, but when you see it academically, it's tarkiln, T-A-R-K-I-L-N. So when you're out talking to old-timers, particularly in Eastern North Carolina, you hear that word, ring it up and give me a call and we'll have a party at the pine. But also these men were derided as tar babies or tar heels. So Great Britain traded hemp with the Tuscarora Nation. Has anybody heard of the Tuscaroras? Tuscaroras, okay. They were the largest indigenous people east of the Mississippi, and their home was eastern North Carolina. So the British kind of negotiated with them to establish these custom ports of Bath. After the Naval Stores Act of 1705, there's Bath, first port town, oldest town in what later became North Carolina, New Bern, 1710, and Beaufort, 1712. And these were all British custom ports. The British, I just described the process of making tar out in the forest. If you were able to do that, you could get your tar to the port, you could get it out and evade British customs. This became a source of tax evasion and part of the revolution in particularly southeastern North Carolina, centered around Brunswick town in particular. So the British required all crude to come to the custom ports and be distilled so that they could regulate the trade. And they had laws against the unregulated trade. They had literally agents processioning through the forest looking at what you're doing. And so this kind of interaction with the British is one of these agitations that led up to the revolution, particularly in Carolina. So you see a circa 1500 map of the indigenous peoples in what we now call North Carolina. The Tuscarora, and you can see in green, taking up the majority of eastern North Carolina, were the most powerful people, and I like to say African, European, indigenous, in colonial America. And they tended to scalp settlers. That was how you became a Tuscarora brave. You would go to another usual Indian nation and come back with a scalp, you were brave. But when the Europeans showed up, hey. So this, of course, couldn't work. And so the English fought two Tuscarora wars. As I mentioned earlier, the Tuscarora and the English had kind of negotiated New Bern and Bath and Beaufort as these custom ports, but were warned not to come any further. Well, there's a guy named John Lawson, he's a former governor, and Baron de Graffenried, who was a land surveyor appointed by the Crown, a guy from Switzerland who brought a colony of Palatine folks to New Bern. And they didn't pay any attention to what the Tuscarora. They actually got on their boat and went up the river from New Bern, surveying, and came across the Nusiag village and was now present-day Kingston, North Carolina. And they experienced the wrath of the Tuscarora. And so with that, the English could not declare war on them, but they declared war on them and actually lost the first war. So they declared a second war, and therein is the process of splitting Carolina, which is another history program. But at the same time, if you can imagine, this is the Wild West of colonial era, right? This giant bounty, this gold rush for the crude in Carolina, and then you have England at the same time outlawing privateering, but not all the privateers are wanting to not privateer anymore. So there's this one guy, I think everybody knows this guy, Blackbeard, right?
Yeah.
Edward Teach. Well, you know, he was bribing the governor here, and he wanted to retire as a Carolina planter. How did that go? Well, anybody ever wonder why the Carolina Crown or the Carolina government didn't go after Blackbeard, but the Virginia Governor Spotswood came after in Carolina waters Blackbeard? And that was because of this Wild West that was going on in Carolina that the Crown was barely able to manage. So these events, along with general tax evasion, as I mentioned, and led to a split of Carolina along an unnatural boundary through the Longleaf Pocosin, which is a Native American term for swamp, with lonely pine bluffs. I was mentioning to our friend Margaret and and Debbie Crane, we were at the archives a couple weeks ago about this boundary between North and South Carolina that you see kind of on the screen here. Originally, it went like this. Well, this part is all swamp and Pocosin up to about the PD River here, and the Yadkin River. And so it literally was impenetrable. And so the British did a dance and split it. But I'll share with you as an archivist, I worked with a guy from the US Geodetic Survey for many years who wanted to verify that boundary. And he called me after I had come over to the museum from the archives, and he says, I found it. In 2016, the boundary between North and South Carolina was finally confirmed. That is how swampy and thick it is in that part of the Carolinas, or it was originally. So by 1718, the crude turpentine industry anchored Great Britain with the resources to colonize a fourth of the earth with a royal navy and a seemingly inexhaustible supply of turpentine, pitch, tar, and hemp from its prized Carolina colony. Now, what you see in the image, and I think, Joanna mentioned I'm a curator, and one of the things I do is I talk to people about artifacts and, what they want to do when they come to the Museum of History or another repository. But from my angle, I want to at least record the information, even if they keep it in private hands. And so what you see here is one of my turpentine friends who calls me and says, hey, I got something really neat. A boxing axe, as you see there, 3 to 4 inches wound, as I mentioned, between the bark of the Longleaf tree to induce bleeding of the sap before hacking into the cambium layer. Ouch. That sounds like it hurt this. If I was the tree, I would say ouch. So, Britain declared the split between North and South Carolina by establishing both North and South Carolina as royal colonies, with an emphasis on the northern part of North Carolina on turpentine, tar, naval stores production, and on the southern part on South Carolina with the production of rice and indigo. Even though they intersect, we can grow rice all the way up to Washington, North Carolina. And as I mentioned, naval stores were pretty much dominant down to about Charleston and up to what's now present-day Columbia, South Carolina on the Congaree River. But you see the reduced bounties that were put in place after all of the hubbub and the crown and the headaches that Carolina was giving them. In 1725, the crown appointed a governor named George Burrington, who never even set foot over here. That's how tense it was. So the reduced geographic boundaries of 1729 also signaled a shift in naval stores production from the Albemarle region in northeastern North Carolina across the Tar and Neuse River basins and the eastern central part of the state, where the crude industry in the Cape Fear River basin in the southeastern part of the state eventually superseded all of those, and Britain established this new place called Southport in 1725. Brunswick Town, it's Southport now, Brunswick Town. Well, this was the seat really of American rebellion more than anything, because not only of the bounties, but on the colony side, there were turpentine factors who acted as nothing less than colonial mafia. And let's just say if you all got land grants from the Crown, and your grant is 640 acres of pine forest, what are you gonna do with that? You need to build a home, you need to get some income from it because you're gonna be charged taxes. So what are you gonna do? Well, you're gonna call one of these guys the Moors, and they're gonna come over with their guys, their Guinea people, their Guinea men, and they're gonna work your forest for you, and they're gonna negotiate some type of split with you. And the best thing I could tell people today is if you buy a wooded lot and you call a timber guy, you and the timber guy might make a deal. This is similar would happen on a regular basis, but there are little cliques of people who take advantage of this, and they say, hey, you want me to clear your land, don't you? It's a mighty lonely place out here in the Colonial Woods with the Tuscarora and everybody running around. It'd be a shame for something to happen to you in this land grant. So wouldn't you like for us to help facilitate you getting that to Southport? Whereas at Southport, some of these same folks were bribing the British agents. And so this became a problem for the British in particular, because again, they wanted to anchor their colonialism on the ships and the naval stores being produced now out of North Carolina. So this new place called Wilmington up the river is established in 1739. And it was specifically as a way to almost not negate Brunswick Town, but to hopefully circumvent the folks who were basically coordinating a lot of this tax evasion, which was basically in an arc of about Wilmington, present-day Wilmington, to about present-day Georgetown, South Carolina, and inland to about present-day Elizabethtown is where a lot of that chicanery took place. So this shift in demographics also meant that there were lots of South Carolinians and colonists from Barbados with more Africans and more stricter slave codes coming into the new colony of North Carolina. And so by the 1750s, the Cape Fear region enumerated about half of the population of the whole state, and the whole state, or about 124,000 people roughly counted, about 1/3 of those folks at that time were enslaved. So what you see on the screen is a crude map that your favorite farmer and historian drew up for this presentation to kind of help illustrate the settlement and the movement of the naval stores industry. So within 10 years of the bounty, 3 port towns have been established, as I mentioned, Bath, 1705, New Bern, 1710, and Beaufort. So Bath and Beaufort were also ports of entry or custom districts, and these towns were doing some very brisk business until complaints about not only the bribery, but the demand was so high for naval stores that they're getting pine straw and all types of residue in the crude. And it's just not passing the inspection, but it's a second rate. But these towns were doing brisk business, and so the Crown really needed to get a hold of it, and they revoked that early bounty for the newer bounties. But if you see illustrated on the map, going from the northeastern part of the state, you can see kind of follow the timeline. Albemarle Precinct, the first county, I guess you can say, Chowan, in 1768, where present-day Edenton is, which used to be the Chowanoke Village, or the Chowanoke Indian Village. And you can see that hooks up into the Nottoway and the Black River that goes back into Virginia, where there were naval stores going on at that time. Then as those are tapped out and these are turned into plantations, as I mentioned in Halifax, is created in 1760, by about 1800, everything north of the Roanoke River had pretty much been tapped out. There were a few isolated places, so the industry shifts further down to the Tar River, or the Ta River. Has anybody ever said Ta? Yeah. That's a real Eastern North Carolina pronunciation. Well, that pronunciation comes directly from the Tuscarora, because tar is a Tuscarora word, or Ta is a Tuscarora word. And so Ta-borough actually was a place established in 1732. But it's kind of like this insurance commercial with a certain actor that says, can't make his R's. So he says R and R, and they go back and forth. Well, the Crown kind of did that with the colonists. And so it's not going to be Ta-borough anymore. It's going to be Tar-borough. So the Crown and the Colonial Assembly established Tarboro in 1760 at the highest navigable point on the Ta River, coming down into the Sound, Pamlico Sound here. And once a lot of these are tapped out, the industry moves down into the Neuse River Basin. And this would be about where New Bern is. As I mentioned, the Chowanoke, Kingston here. Kingston, named for King George III, 1762, had turpentine distilleries there also, but not regulated by the Crown. After 1784, when they changed, they take the G out for King George and turn it to Kingston. And then coming further down, as I mentioned, these are where the industry really concentrates after a lot of these areas are turned over into tobacco, cotton, corn, sweet potato plantations. But if you notice, as you come inland here, the British claim Anson County But this county is not even formed from the swamp until 1787. The British, right at the beginning of the Revolution, commissioned what was called the Charlotte about here, to Elizabethtown Plank Road in 1774. And it opened up that area. And after 1774, it extended on to Wilmington. That is called Interstate 74 today, kind of a play on words, but 1774. And that opened up the backcountry for what were some naval stores, but I dare say, I drive on this, and it's hard to find even a longleaf pine along that corridor today. So what you see on the screen is a port bond for the sloop Betsy and Nancy from the British Customs House at Beaufort, pronounced Beaufort in North Carolina, not to be confused with Beaufort in South Carolina, spelled the same way. So what you see on the screen, listed on that payload, 101 barrels of tar, 98 barrels of turpentine, 7 barrels of pitch, 5 barrels of wax and tallow, 57 hides of leather, likely buffalo, running through the savannah.
Wow.
That are now extinct. And then beneath it, to differentiate from the hides of leather, are hides of deerskin, 69. 4 cakes of wax and tallow. William Till, for the due landing whereof in this port bond was given, and Beaufort aforesaid, given under my hand and seal, 21 February 1761. The Betsy and Nancy sloop was laden with a payload. You could probably retire on this one load. According to 1729 bounty, 101 barrels of tar equal 224 pounds of British currency, and 98 pounds for the pitch. That's a lot of mucho dinero. This staggering amount of money did not include the other commodities on the boat. The British custom collector was likely pining to get this bond signed. So by the time of the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, approximately 1/3 of 270,000, I mentioned, North Carolinians were still enslaved. We just fought to be free, but 1/3 of us are still enslaved. So the French traveler came through this part of the world, and he noted that turpentine by that time had become so streamlined that one man can readily care for 3,000 boxes. That's a lot of hacking. 2 to 4 boxes per tree, and that number is generally assigned one Negro. The Negro is doing most of the work. In the rainy weather, the outflow is less. It is reckoned that from 3,000 boxes, more than 120 barrels should be obtained in that summer. That's a mucho dinero. So what you see again is an unidentified man hacking, and there's a end of a hack here I'll share with you. This normally would have a handle on it, but the handle has long been disintegrated. But this was usually fashioned by local blacksmiths. There's a company called Council Tools down in the Sandhills, Bladen County, I think they are, that actually started making these in the 1880s when our production was going down, but out in Georgia and Alabama, they were going up. So you actually find most of these now out in Georgia and Alabama instead of North Carolina. But these would have a handle that could adjust size where you could hack the tree, as you see the man in the image doing there. So from 1705 until the fiery end of the Civil War in 1865, North Carolina led the world in naval stores production. And that is, again, the production of turpentine, tar, pitch, and rosin, sometimes including staves or roofing staves, and sometimes including what is called here camphor. Has anybody ever heard of this, camphor, or know what this is? I know you know what that is. This is dried up sap from the ground that was left over, that would have been left over by the real Tar Heels. And so usually children who were enslaved, their job was to go and collect this and sell it at a market, because this was the #1 lighting product in the world before Lewis Latimer and Thomas Edison made the filament in a light bulb. High demand these commodities are. So, wooden boats, as I mentioned, were the mode for the largest migration in human history from the old world to the new world, and even from the Far East to the new world. So once again, you see unidentified real tar heels hacking it during the colonial era in the Longleaf pine forest. Has anybody ever heard of some of these terms? Can you hack it?
Yeah.
Right, that's what you're doing. You're hacking it, all right? So, I'm going to read part of an excerpt of an upcoming article for this botanical garden that you'll see, but what you see on the screen, I'll share with you. But as I mentioned, I'm a farmer, and I purchased my farm from one of the largest Black farmers in the state, a man named Mr. David Richardson, about 30 years ago in the middle 1990s. And he wasn't really pining to sell. What he was doing was canvassing to know, like a lot of country people in Johnstown, why do you want to buy this? And I said, I counted 6 longleaf pine trees, and his eye lit up and says, well, what do you, like college boy, college guy, what do you know about longleaf pines? And so I told him what I thought was a tar heel, and that was somebody who redeems the bounty. You should have seen the look on his face. He says, what do you know about longleaf pines? And as I mentioned, someone who redeems the bounty. And so the wise farmer patiently then replied, son, let me tell you what a real tar heel is or was. It was another word for the N word, is what he says. Yes, if they knew what was right in Chapel Hill, they would have a Black man with a hack at the basketball games. And quote, end quote. And of course, as a wolf packer, I could hack it because I said, you know, they hacked us in the game and they got away with it. At any rate. So he went on to share his genealogy, but Mr. Richardson was born in 1917 and passed in 2016. Literally, he was still farming at that age. He acquired his farm in 1857, or his family. He tells me this story, as his grandfather was the son of an enslaved man and the daughter of the slaveholder. Now, once again, the wise archivist historian says, hey, was he lynched? No, he looked at me like I was crazy. He says, no, that's how we got this land. And I had to go back with my tail between my legs and think about it. And I said, money, it's about money. I said, that man, whoever was Pope Richardson's father, probably made that slaveholder, Applewhite Richardson, so much money that he gifted the land to probably his daughter, because the child by slave code in North Carolina was free colored or free mulatto. Now, sometimes slaveholders would abdicate that responsibility, but in this case, evidently, Applewhite Richardson did not. He owned more than 30,000 acres of land that basically spanned from about the Williamson Tract, which is in eastern Wake County on Poplar Creek, across northern Johnston County into southern Nash, where he had a cotton gin, a sawmill, and a turpentine distillery. Very wealthy man. And in the 1850s, at the height of the futures, he probably made all this money so that he just gifted that thousands of acres of land and didn't even think much about it. So the tar trees have disappeared along the Tar River. If you see any, let me know. We're gonna have a party at the pond. The photo shows an unidentified real tar heel. Woman at Riverside Park in Nash County by the Tar River about 1920. I went looking for that tree, by the way. Couldn't find it, it's not there. I have to warn you though, if you ride with me or I ride with you or we ride in the bus together, we're gonna be looking for longleaf. All right? So my kids know that when we go somewhere, you gotta just put on your headphones, ignore pops. So about 10 years ago on the way back from Myrtle Beach, coming up Highway 71, stop! But the Bojangles up there, we stop here. I pointed to this tree, I said, kids, y'all know what this is? No, don't care. Just take the picture, get in the car. But that is what evidence of a real Tar Heel, or what a tree that used to have one of these at the base of it would look like. So if you're driving around and you see that, and it's a lone leaf, stop, call me, email, we'll have a party at the Pine. Sometimes these trees have been known to form a callus, and it looks almost like a surgical scar wound. And you can look in between it and you can see hacks sometimes. That's when you really get deep in the weeds. Various hardwood and invasive species have warped the forest economy and ecosystem. This is a 1920 photo that I found when I was a photograph archivist that was in the late 1990s, about 2000 timeframe, that shows harvesting longleaf pine trees, and you can see the immense size of these trees. But what caught my eye in that photograph are these babies here that are nearly extinct. These are sable palms that you can see dotting the landscape here in the back, in the foreground. And that is in present-day Harnett County. So this ecosystem that included native palms, and the whole reason why I, as a farmer, got involved with growing longleaf is because I started growing palms for commercial and residential landscape use. But I discovered that they grow in the same symbiotic relationship, because when I burn my forest, these burn and they grow back. So the palms are closer in the plant kingdom to grasses than they are to trees, and fit perfectly in the ecosystem, in this natural ecosystem. So I was just bubbling over like a charcoal mound when I put the two together. And these items, display items, are from the farm and offered for sale for anyone who wants them after the program. So, your favorite farmer and historian points out if you were in the woods, you would think it was a little Bigfoot originally, but it's not. It's a dead or dying lonely pine sapling in the sandhills of North Carolina, being invaded by hardwood trees, just like the photograph that I just shared with you. That photograph went to that spot in 2006 after they had logged again, and now has Bradford pears, maple trees, and cookie cutter subdivision. So, but in the natural setting, when you eliminate that, you get hardwood invasion, and of course, we all know you can't get germination unless you have a burn or massive replanting, and both, to bring back the land of the longleaf pine. So, attention real Tar Heels, that means all y'all out here and online. Most longleaf pines are now in residential communities and with small landowners. The largest single tract, as I mentioned, is in Waymouth Woods in Moore County, North Carolina, 600 or so acres, and really only about a third of that is still virgin. And the tree in the foreground was likely boxed before the Civil War, and this home was built in 1965. And I got all this information because the person who I credit, Miss Catherine Bury, used to be a registrar at our museum, and she says, "Earl, I got one of those." I says, "You're a real Tar Heel." I went to NC State. I said, "Well, it's okay." So question, what is a Tar Heel? Answer, any person blessed enough to have been born under the Carolina blue sky and bleeds Wolfpack red. All right. So after the naval storage bounties were redeemed, the trees were usually harvested for timber and forests cleared for plantations. And if you see that little arrow at the bottom of the picture, that guy's named John L. Roper. He was a timber baron from Norfolk, Virginia. And he basically established operations when Norfolk and Southern the seaboard extended their railroad line from Norfolk into northeastern North Carolina. And his company is primarily the one that harvested the last of the longleaf virgin forest. And you can see he's standing beside one in that photograph at the bottom, and you can see him to scale to the tree. The tree, I would say, is at least 80 feet.
Wow.
So here's to the land. Y'all join me if you know the toast. Here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun does shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong grow great, here's the down home in the old North State. All right. Y'all are doing good. So this is a great longleaf pine forest, was originally 93 million acres, as I mentioned. Down to its smallest, about 15, 20 years ago, it was around 1 million acres. We just recently had news that it's up to about 5 million, thanks to real tar heels coming out and replanting and burning and stuff. And you could be a tar heel outside North Carolina, all y'all in virtual world. The largest single tract, as I mentioned, is the Waymouth Woods, and I'm sitting in Waymouth Woods there during film production of The Bleeding Pines and Turpentine, and I'm talking particularly about the unique mix of people in the southeastern part of the state where Scotch-Irish, indigenous people, African Americans all came together and were literally working in the forest, integrated together as real tar heels. So, do we have enough time to view the film, or we just want to skip it?
I think we'll share it in a follow-up email.
Okay, great. So if you get a chance to look at the film, Preserving Longleaf Pines, as I mentioned, it won an Emmy Award for the most educational film a couple of years ago, and you can find it online. But also, as I mentioned, I'm a Winston-Salem native, and every time I've been looking for longleaf in Winston-Salem for a long time, and I've found them, and I've gotten so good at it, I've become a pain to the folks at Old Salem. I say, you got some longleaf there. Well, believe it or not, I went there last week and I told the folks, hey, we got this presentation, we got this exhibit, Saving Our Savannas. You might want to consider it because you got longleaf. Well, we went out to God's Acre and you see what we see, we think we need the core and still test it. But the botanist there at Old Salem Museum and Gardens was with me, and we both had been eyeballing and talking about this tree and these trees for months, literally. And so we went out, and those needles are every bit of 9 inches, and the trees are right next to the Salem Parkway, which is right next to the old 311 highway, which is the original Fayetteville and Western Plank Road. So there's a little bit of relationship with that too. So, esse quam videre, to be rather than to sing. Thank you for preserving our history and planting our future. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this history to us today. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And we may have time for one question in the room.
I've heard the term cat face, and I think I saw it in some of your photos. Can you explain that?
You did. That's also called a chevron, but that's a direct result of the hack. So when you hack the tree, as I mentioned, this has a stem. When you hack it, it forms the V's like that. And so when you hack it, then you'll scrape, my scraper's missing, but you'll scrape the sap down into the reservoir, and then you stir it. But the cat face is usually the evidence is left on the trees if the trees are still living, or sometimes if there's a stump and you can see it, that's the evidence more than anything that you'll see is the chevron of the cat face. Yeah, great question, thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you online for being here as well. We will hear from Earl later in the series again, so please join us for future events of Saving Our Savannas. So glad to have you with us today again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.